cup of coffee.
Okay, you can start anytime.
Okay, we're rolling. All right, well, thank you, first of all, to the organizers for organizing this. It's been a really interesting meeting so far. And thank you for inviting me. As to the topic I've been assigned, I'm not sure whether to thank you or not, or curse you. Time will tell. But I'm certainly not a religious scholar, and I think probably I'm not even religious. I think I am a scholar, but not on this topic. But you know, Mark Bullock asked if I wanted to talk about this, and I said, well, you know, why would I talk about that? That's not what I normally talk about. But he pointed out that I have done some writing on this topic in a couple of my popular books and in a couple of articles in astronomy magazines and science magazines. I've delved into a little bit a scientist's perspective on spirituality and the relationship with science and all. And I've even written some about potential extraterrestrial belief systems. So I thought, well, why not? Let's give it a try, you know. And it was interesting to me in that that last talk we just heard, really interesting. It was about, you know, from a very human perspective, which is appropriate. We're humans, but you know, thinking about extraterrestrial values, there's another way to think about it. You know, what would the extraterrestrials think about all that? And we talk about things like, well, you know, we would agree to set aside some space for them to have their natural habitat. Well, you know, it's conceivable that when we interact with extraterrestrials, that we won't be the ones necessarily setting the rules. We won't necessarily be the ones in charge. How would we feel if they decided to set aside some natural habitat for us? How would we feel if they didn't? So, you know, I think at least it is a subject that we don't have any data on, but at least as a Gedanken experiment, it's probably worthwhile to think about a little bit in the overall context of this meeting. So here goes nothing. Now, in thinking about what this talk ought to be about, the phrase extraterrestrial spirituality is ambiguous, and I wasn't even sure. You know, there are a few ways to interpret that, and I thought, well, I could talk about the emerging spiritual, quasi-religious views of extraterrestrials in 20th, 21st century culture on Earth. And you know, there's some good books about this. I recommend The Lure of the Edge by Brenda Densler, who talked about you know, the religious aspect of UFO cults. And John Mack is a fascinating character who you know, sort of in a way had his own extraterrestrial cult. Really smart guy at Harvard with some really wacky ideas about alien abductions. But you know, so that's an aspect of what could be called extraterrestrial spirituality. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. What I want to talk about a little bit is just how thinking about alien spiritual beliefs might be worthwhile as far as trying to winnow out what in our spiritual beliefs might, in some sense, have some universal quality versus just being culturally and historically specific. And I guess in terms of my own beliefs, I mentioned that I don't consider myself religious. I suppose in the taxonomy that Connie gave us yesterday, I would be in that 40% that considers myself spiritual, but not religious. And what do I mean by that? Well, who knows? You know, damn it, Jim, I'm a planetary scientist, not a theologian. But I think for me, the spiritual is kind of religiosity stripped of the religious doctrine. It's, if you take all the world's religions, in a sense, look at what they have in common, which I think is a lot in terms of values, and you sort of try to extract those commonalities and take away the doctrine, there's a core that remains of values, perhaps like compassion And you know, you can try to make a list. That's not what I'm going to do right now. That to me is spirituality. And Connie talked about how these sort of spiritual but not religious people are lacking doctrine. But to me, the science actually provides the doctrine. And this, what I'm calling spiritual versus religion, is also a form of, I'm not even sure it's belief, it's almost an attitude, an openness to mystery that is more consistent with science than more doctrinal kinds of beliefs, for me. And it's also, I think, when considering possible beliefs of extraterrestrials, I think it's probably ludicrous to imagine they'll have the same religions as we do in the specifics. You know, people used to imagine that there might be a planet-hopping Jesus to solve the question of, like, well, do they need a savior too, since we have a savior, and things like that. But they will have at least, I would argue, confronted some of the same spiritual problems that we've confronted as far as being conscious beings and what that means and how to get along with other beings and how to understand your place in the world. Some of those spiritual problems I think we will have in common with them in a broad sense, and it would be very interesting if we could ever find out what their answers to those questions are. Maybe they've had a lot longer than we have to think about it. Maybe if we don't even ever find that out, just asking the question can give us a different perspective on our own struggles. Oh, this is just a quote by Einstein that I like a lot about wholeness. I won't read it. You can read it. But I guess what I would say is that, and again, I don't want to just sit here and talk about my own beliefs, but yeah, it's a nice quote. It's as plausible to me that the universe is a conscious entity as it is that my brain is a conscious entity. Both seem like strange notions, but one doesn't seem more strange than the other to me. Oh, and Woody Allen, you know, asked this timeless question: what if everything is illusion and nothing exists? In that case, I definitely overpaid for my carpet. Okay. Well, something weird has happened to the Earth. If you've been watching it for a long time, say billions of years, you notice that it's slowly changed. The continents greener, the ice caps have come and gone. But if you've been looking at the nights, and you may have noticed if you've got infrared eyes that the composition of the atmosphere's changed in some interesting ways. But if you've been looking at the night side, there hasn't been that much happening. The occasional flash of lightning, the occasional brush fire, you know, for billions of years. And then all of a sudden, it's like, whoa, look at that. Something weird. The coastal areas have lit up in these weird grid-like patterns of, you know, something new is happening on the Earth. And if we think of the long-term evolution, you can think in very broad strokes of the geosphere giving rise to the biosphere a long time ago, and then very, very recently, the biosphere giving rise to what some people call the noosphere, the sort of sphere of conscious activity and alteration of the Earth and technology, and, you know, that whatever this change is that suddenly made the night side light up, there's a bunch of really new, really strange activity on the Earth. And it's interesting to contemplate what that transition is in the abstract, and if that's also happening or has happened or will happen elsewhere in the universe. And we've heard a lot at this conference about how, in various ways, this is a critical time in history. And, you know, it's always suspect, every time in history people think that. But in the context of us venturing into space and the decisions we make now affecting us for millennia, we've heard a lot about that. And, you know, I've been predicting this for a while. Arthur Kessler said that within the foreseeable future, we'll either destroy ourselves or take off for the stars. And good old H.G. told us that our choice is either the universe or nothing, and that human history becomes more and more a race between education and catastrophe, that there's this critical point approaching in some sense. And in Penny's talk, we heard some, you know, better, more recent quotes about also the way that we've very recently sort of been altering the rules in some ways with genetic engineering and all these things that, you know, there's a lot that's changing fast and accelerating now. And Woody, again, pointed out that more than any other time in history, mankind faces a crossroads. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness, the other to total extinction. Let us pray we have the wisdom to choose correctly. Okay. And then, you know, what kinds of evolution can lead to this sort of phenomena? You know, does it take particular biological forms to be able to make these transitions so that there are other kinds of intelligent animals that cannot become technological? Or is this a widespread potentiality? Again, well expressed by America's best news source, The Onion. Well, one time-tested way to think about alien life, intelligent alien life, is the good old Drake equation. And there's our friend Frank himself. And I'm not going to talk about, I think probably you've seen the Drake equation before and you know sort of what these numbers mean. I hope so, because I don't have time to go into it in detail. But basically, it's a way of estimating the number of communicating intelligent civilizations in the galaxy, given various assumptions about what fraction of stars have planets and of what fraction of those stars develop life and intelligence and all that stuff. And you know, it's not a really useful equation for getting a specific number, getting an answer, because you know, it depends on all these assumptions. But it's a very useful equation for it's a heuristic equation. It's useful for thinking about the problem and saying, well, if we increase this factor, what effect does that have on the answer? So it's useful in that way. And these estimates are from the original Green Bank meeting, really the first SETI meeting ever, and they were very optimistic in some ways. It is interesting that we've learned the answer, or we're learning the answer to some of these wild guesses then, like the fraction of stars with planets. We are, you know, on the edge of having, and the number in the habitable zone, we will certainly, or the habitable E zone, as it says here, we will very soon actually know these numbers. Some of these numbers we're gaining knowledge of. Some of the other ones, it's going to probably be a while, but who knows. But the point I really want to make about the Drake equation is that I think it's flawed. I don't think it's really the right equation. And that's because it's a steady state equation. This last factor, L, is supposed to be the average longevity of civilizations. You know, do all civilizations blow themselves up after 100 years, in which case it would be you know, a relatively little number, or do all civilizations last for tens of thousands or millions of years, in which case it would be a big number? In my view, there is no L, really, because I don't see it as a steady state. In other words, there's an implicit assumption here that this N stays constant, that L is a lifetime, and that the number of civilizations being created is the same. The rate at which civilizations is being created is the same rate at which they're going extinct. But let's think about this L a little bit. And here's a cartoon in the upper left of possible distribution function, a probability distribution function of the longevity of civilizations. And if it's just sort of like this bump on the left, is there a laser pointer up here? Or does anybody have one? I can just gesticulate wildly, but it might be easier to actually point. If we just think of it as a distribution, maybe something like this bump on the left, where some of them last longer. Thank you very much. Some of them are shorter, and then there's, you know, some peak, and this would be the average. This would be L. Then that then L, you know. Sorry, this should probably be little l, because L in the previous one meant the average. So the average would be somewhere in the middle here. What I mean here is not L the average. L this is a probability distribution of different lifetimes of civilizations. So this shape would determine, you know, if there were more out here, it would mean more civilizations could last longer. So maybe this is, you know, this might be an exponential curve. This might be 10 years, 100 years, whatever, millions of years. But then, given all this talk about a transition coming, that we will either you know, go to the stars and last a long time, or we'll die, I think that this is probably a common feature for civilizations confronting technology and confronting global implications of their actions. And that technology is something that probably, and intelligence even, the thing that we call intelligence that we have, which I see as a sort of proto-intelligence, is something probably isn't always conducive to long-term survival. but sometimes it probably is. And a lot of people have talked about this sort of bottleneck effect, that if we make it through this period of transition to a global society and a technological society, that technology could potentially become something that really facilitates long-term survival. You can reach a stage where you have a deep understanding of nature and a deep self-understanding and an ability to forestall natural disasters like asteroid impacts, even ultimately guard against things happening to your planet or your sun because you're more widely distributed. Now, the point is that doesn't have to be very likely. I'm certainly not saying I think that most civilizations will make this transition. I'm not even saying that I believe that we will make this transition. But if you believe that kind of a transition is possible, then the distribution, I think, should look like this, where there's this bump, and there's then sort of a delta function here. And these are the immortals. These have solved that problem. And then the reason why this is a delta function is because these guys are going to live forever. Or not really forever, but for the rest of the age of the universe. Okay? And again, this is not an optimistic statement necessarily, because I'm not saying that I think we will be able to do this. I don't know how likely that is. But if you admit at all that it's possible, and I think there's a good argument that it is, it may be, one in some very small, it could be a very small fraction, a very small probability of making this transition. But if there is this kind of a distribution function where some species make it to this very stable quasi-immortal state, then instead of a steady state like the Drake equation where n doesn't change, then n is increasing over time, because once some species have made this transition, they stick around, they don't die. If you will, they're like vampires. Once you get made into a vampire, you stay a vampire forever, and you sometimes make other people into vampires. I don't know if you're familiar with vampire lore, but it's true. So the number of vampires actually increases. But the undead. The point is these guys can't be killed, so they don't have a lifetime. Okay, so the number increases. And it may not be increasing linearly, because maybe some of these guys decide it's good to help some of these guys become like them. Maybe not, but if they do, then it's going to be highly nonlinear. And some people have even proposed that sort of a transition point to what Stanislaw Lem called the Psychozoic age of the universe. I don't know about that, but I think that there's an argument to be made for this kind of distribution, and that the number is actually increasing. And so, if the probability of a transition to wisdom and immortality is small but finite, then the universe must be increasingly permeated with intelligence. Personally, I believe there are quasi-immortal civilizations out there, and they are probably capable of doing things that we would consider to be godlike. And this is sort of an expression of Clarke's third law, that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, but it's also an expression of belief that the distribution function of lifetimes might be like this. And once people have had a long time to think about nature and technology and even spiritual questions, they, if we contacted them, they might seem as gods contacted us. So this leads me to what I call a sort of cosmic optimism. I don't necessarily think our long-term prospects are great, but I think the prospects for intelligence in the universe are great. So yes, there is lots of hope. Not for us, necessarily. Now, this leads to all kinds of bizarre possibilities. I think that given this perspective of a population of really civilizations, for instance, things like directed panspermia are not all that unlikely. Somebody somewhere probably has the ability to design organisms. Somebody somewhere, we did it?
Yeah, 1997 Sojourner. It's a vehicle, we have microbes on it, we send it to Mars. That's directed panspermia.
In a sense, yeah. So, I mean, that basically reinforces my argument that it's not interstellar directed panspermia, but it's not implausible, given extensions of what we're already doing, that somebody could do the kind of thing that Francis Crick proposed here. And okay, granted, it turns out that Crick was on acid when he came up with a double helix structure, but still, he's a pretty smart guy. And if you read this book, which basically promotes the possibility of directed panspermia, it's not all that unreasonable. It's hard to refute, actually. And especially given developments since Crick wrote this book. Like a 17-year-old Romanian-American teenager won this science talent search by designing a DNA strand that had the message June 6, Invasion Normandy in it. And the point is that we're not far off from designing basically what organisms we want and sending them wherever we want. And we are so primitive. Imagine what somebody else could do. Now, I'm not advocating this. I'm not saying that I think this got here. But it's just interesting the possibilities that this opens up.
Can you just tell us what Crick's argument was? I don't know.
Yeah, so Crick's argument, in a nutshell, because I have other things I want to mention, was that we don't know the probability that organic life formed in situ on Earth. We have theories about that. We have ideas about that, but we don't have a well-developed theory yet that takes us from organics to organisms. We certainly have indications that it's maybe not that unlikely. We have things like ribozymes in RNA world, which are kind of like the Kon-Tiki demonstrating that it maybe could be done, but we don't know how if that's how it was done. So then there's a finite probability, but unknown probability that life happened that way. But there's also, Crick wrote, a finite probability that life is here because somebody decided they ought to seed life throughout the universe. And he went through various numbers about the possibility of very advanced organisms and the possibility of genetic engineering, and that it may seem far out, but it's basically a probability argument. And he said it's not certain that the probability of life happening spontaneously on a given planet is greater than the probability of life having been seeded. And it's a good book. I mean, I don't necessarily believe that it tells us how we got here, but I think it's worth reading. And but it's also interesting to me that developments since this book was written in the developments since then in both biotechnology and space technology, and some things we've learned about survival of organisms in different environments actually make this not less likely, but more likely than Crick wrote. So,
David, a follow-up on that?
Yeah.
Crick's argument, does he distinguish clearly between intentional and non-intentional seeding?
Yeah, he's talking about intentional. Yeah. Yeah. Let me keep going because I haven't gotten near my punchline, but hopefully there'll be time for some questions. Okay, so whoops. So I guess the other point I would make here is that it's even true, I think, given this consideration, that the notion of intelligent design is not absurd. And we tend to get caught up in these cultural wars and take these positions and just want to say everybody taking another position is stupid. And the specific arguments for intelligent design pretty much are stupid. but people have made the claim that it's not logically plausible to look for things like irreducible complexity and to look for signs of artifacts in life. And I don't think that's at all true. I think the problem with intelligent design is that there isn't good evidence for it. But the notion of searching for that evidence in an organism is not inherently absurd. That's just the point I wanted to make. And we can return to that if you want, but I want to move on. So as we search and find new phenomena, we should just be careful how we interpret things and really be open to anything. And here's a classical example of misinterpretation. Zippy sees these strange structures. He says there's only one explanation for these shapes. No human hand could have anything to do with placing them here. They're obviously of alien design, but it turns out that he's in a miniature golf course. So, mistakes can be made. And so, yeah, we should just observe carefully with, really every means we have as we explore the universe. But now, I want to move on to a little bit more specifics. I wrote an article that was published in Astronomy magazine in the year 2000 called "Is the Truth Out There? SETI and the Science Wars." And it's just about the notion of what can we learn by actually contacting aliens and learning about their physics and math, and then what can we learn by even doing that thought experiment in the absence of having that experiment. Everybody or anybody remember wars? They seem to have sort of calmed down, but there was a period of time where there was this really heated debate between postmodernists, humanists, and some irascible scientists. And
who do you think won?
I'll get to that. This debate was sort of epitomized by the SoCal hoax, where this physicist named Alan Sokal decided he was pissed off. part of the problem with the science wars is that sociologists and philosophers of science do have a habit of appropriating scientific language for metaphorical purposes and misusing or sometimes misunderstanding the scientific terminology. And this, unfortunately, leads to an impression among many scientists that, that people who do science studies don't know what they're talking about. Now, that's not true. Of course, there's a lot of really smart people doing science studies, but there is also a lot of language abuse that leads to this impression. And Alan Sokal is definitely one of those people. So he's decided to do an experiment. He wrote a paper called Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity. And he intentionally wrote this as a complete piece of bullshit. And he thought, well, I wonder if I can get away with writing a science studies, philosophy of science, sociology of science paper that doesn't say anything but uses all this science language and is complete bull, and I wonder if I can get it published in a humanities journal called Social Text, not more specific. A cultural studies, science studies journal, and they did publish it, and he went, aha, and then he exposed it, and it was this hoax, and then he's been criticized, and it really heated things up, and I don't want to pass a verdict on that right now. I'm just using it to illustrate the science wars, to raise a question, which then I'll try to tell you, well, how I eliminated it, maybe in a slightly different way in this article. So what's happening with the science wars is that postmodernist scholars often have a penchant dismissing scientific knowledge as culturally derived. And the extreme position, constructivism, is that a scientific paper is just another story, another text, wholly constructed in the mind of the scientist, culturally embedded and subject to his or her particular biases and experiences. So my reaction to this is always, well, something like, so if Newton had been born in another place in time, then the inverse square law of gravity might have been an inverse cube law, because he would have had different ideas, and falling bodies would different paths. So you can, it's not hard to ridicule this extreme position. Most anyone who has experienced scientific discovery, we have a strong conviction that the universe, in a sense, is trying to tell us something, or at least that there is something real that we're actually discovering. We're not just inventing, we're discovering things. We know that however imperfect our process, we're under at least a dim sensation, a dim determination, a dim hint at something real. It's not all just made up in our heads. And therefore, scientists get insulted when they're told by people who at least sometimes misunderstand what they do, that our results are merely just sort of illusion and social construct. On the other hand, in some respects, of course, science is culturally determined. Newton's law of gravity was, just an approximation, and then we find out about Einsteinian, it's really about the geometry of time, and then, people are still trying to take Einstein and fold it into some further, more all-encompassing theory. And 50 years ago, plate tectonics was all wrong, and now it's all right. So looking at the history of science in this way, it is clear that at any given time, scientific knowledge is culturally specific, and we approach the truth on some trajectory. And what do we mean by the truth, anyways? Because nobody but some really arrogant cosmologists think that we'll ever find sort of the final theory that explains everything. So, so there are aspects in which science is, of course, culturally determined. So how do we test our scientific knowledge to see if it is really universal? How do we tease out the perhaps universal components from the culturally determined components at any given time? And in this light, it's interesting to think about SETI. If we make contact with intelligent ETs and we can communicate with them, then we either will or we won't the same physical laws. Their math books, I think, will probably have the same illustrations as ours. They won't otherwise be comprehensible, but they might have logarithmic spirals and sine waves and things like that. I would love to know. If our scientific laws are intrinsic, not just from our imaginations, then they should have discovered some of the same ones. So would this finding verify the absolute objective nature of some scientific truths? I think it's, thinking about. But actually, we will never be able to even get to that point unless our science is not, in some sense, universal, because SETI depends on science being universal to succeed. It requires faith in the possibility of universal scientific knowledge that transcends planet or galaxy of origin, because we're assuming they're either using parabolic radio dishes and sending radio waves, or they're using lasers, or they're doing something that's comprehensible to us because they're born of the same universe. some of the same physical principles. So for SETI to work requires that we've discovered some true aspects of the universe. Therefore, SETI is a test of our faith in science, a test of the nature of scientific truth. So that's kind of cool. It's different from the normal purposes we think of for SETI. Ironically, though, SETI itself is probably the best example of a socially constructed science. Much of SETI theory involves trying to second-guess the behavior and motives of alien races. Talk about, well, why do we have this great science? Well, maybe they just want to stay at home. Maybe they don't want to spend the resources, or maybe they're protecting us, or there's all these sociological theories and physical theories about why we haven't detected them yet. But it all depends on second-guessing, figuring out their motivations. So it inevitably requires extrapolations from our own history and our ideas about our future. So this kind of science is hugely dependent on our biases, assumptions, and culture. But I think it's safe to say that unless we're really wrong about the universe in some fundamental way that would preclude us from ever finding extraterrestrial life of any kind, that aliens will have that intelligent aliens will have some science in common with us. But interestingly, I think we can also say that they'll have some history in common with us, given some physical facts about our universe. And so maybe they'll even have some of the same mythology based on some of this common history. What about religions or spirituality? Well, we've heard a lot at this meeting about values and different ways to assess ideas about what we should be doing in the solar system and the universe. Where do our values come from? How should we choose between these different ethics? We got the land ethic, reverence for life, all these other ones we've been hearing about. Maybe we should even talk about nuocentrism, I don't know. But are there universal moral principles, just as there seem to be universal physical laws? Well, maybe. We don't know. But I don't think it's an absurd question to ask. I know there's certainly some philosophers who've talked about this. Okay, I'm running out of time, so according to Chris. So let me just say a few more things. So what about alien spiritual beliefs? Well, it seems unlikely that aliens will have the same religions as humans. Will they have the Quran? I would venture probably not. But they may have some similar spirituality. I think they will have wrestled with some of the same questions about the nature of trying to survive as an intelligent species and intelligent creature and figure out your place in the universe that forms a lot of our spiritual questions. So perhaps it's at least a useful exercise to contemplate potential extraterrestrial spirituality, especially when we think of this branching point of heading off into the universe. And some people think that this means that we're at the beginning of history, as this great quote by that now we're just, changing the surface of the Earth, but someday we'll control the climate in the solar system and travel beyond the limits of our planetary system, reach other suns, and use their energy as well. We're either at the beginning of history, or maybe we're at the end of history. Man has invented his doom. The first step was touching the moon. So it's a good time to be thinking about this stuff. And I had a little bit more I was going to say, but Chris is telling me I'm out of time. So I think I'll just wait. Oh, let me just go back to my last slide because it's so cool. Yeah, we're in the Q&A, but I'm not going to. What I was going to do now actually was read a little bit out of the last section of the last chapter of the last part of Lonely Planets, where I say some of the things that I think prompted Mark to ask me to give this talk. But they're really just kind of elaborations on what I've been saying. So I think I'll just stop here and ask for questions. Thanks. Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
Well, my first question is, will you read what you're...
Oh, it's the wrong mic. Here's the mic.
Still ask the first question. Yeah, my first question, if it takes like a couple of minutes, would you read what you were going to read?
How much time do we actually have, Chris?
You've got 12 minutes.
All right. I think I'm going to take... I will read. I'll try to abbreviate what I was going to read. Because it...
Use the first and last words of each sentence.
The first and last word of each sentence. Okay. Science, spirituality, in name. No, okay. Science has been regarded as our saving grace, the skill that will open up a glorious, safe, long, equitable future for humanity. It has also been cast as our doom. Which will it be? That may be determined by our success at the reunification of science and spirituality. In some scientific circles, religion has a pretty bad name. We get hung up on the specifics, on the stories, taken literally or incompatible with the beautiful truths science has allowed us to uncover. The differences in the story from religion to religion make them all seem arbitrary, just as the sniping between different groups of avid UFO believers casts doubts on all of their stories. Many of us also associate religion with murderous crusades, persecution of insightful thinkers, and especially these days, suicide bombings. Often scientists are suspicious of spirituality in general. Ironically, this attitude helps fuel those belief systems that bother us the most. Okay, I'm going to skip now. I'm going to skip that, and I'm going to move on a little bit. And I talk, this echoing Penny a little bit, but being a little farther out there, I talk about emerging complexity as the pattern linking together all of cosmic evolution. Complexity is a clinical-sounding term, but the principle allows us to see where the structure, beauty, and perhaps even the self-awareness of the universe comes from. I see spirituality as an intuitive of the internal and external forces impelling us to realize our place within this complexifying, unfolding, self-seeking, beauty-wreaking cosmos of ours. Emergent complexity is all about the power to manifest surprising changes at higher levels through forming new connections. Spirituality is embodied in the connections we make with one another and the potential for wider group identification for human love and unity. And then I'll just paraphrase. I talk about natural selection acting on a larger scale than that we're used to, and going back to the relation of wise civilizations, that there ought to be a natural selection of sort of value systems. Cosmic evolution will favor technical advancement with spiritual progress because, and this gets back to some of the other talks we've heard this week, where there are several problems we're confronting that all seem to require a global ethos for survival, and that probably is a common phenomena in the universe. So then I talk about, bizarrely, that idea of cosmic spiritual advancement by Darwinian natural selection acting on a larger scale. Okay, I'm going to skip. So this view makes me see humanity's current predicament, a world rich with technical know-how but rife with inequity, scarcity, and violent conflicts, as fundamentally a spiritual crisis. So where else can we look for new solutions? One answer is to search the skies, and then I talk about SETI as, in a sense, a spiritual quest. Let's see. So will our core spiritual values of love and compassion, etc., be a part of alien religions? Will they even make the same distinction between religion and science? Or will it be all mixed together? Remember, they've had a lot more time to think about all this than we have. If an integration of scientific and spiritual capacities is the key to long-term survival, then advanced ETs will long ago have accomplished this. Okay, I'm going to skip to sort of the end. So thank you, Jeff, for giving me permission to read, but I don't want to all my time. Okay, if I met an ET, that would be my first question, after the usual pleasantries. Not, how do you build your wonderful machines, but how did you learn to live with yourselves? How do you survive the transition to being a global technical species? Do you have a spare user's manual? Thinking about aliens in this way can help us to confront ourselves. Would we measure up? Do we have what it takes? And then I talk about whether psychogenesis is limited to the Earth. So, but anyways, that's basically what I wanted to read. So thank you, Jeff. Does that answer your question?
Pass it back to Kevin right there, and then we'll go to Mark.
Uh-oh.
No, it will be very easy.
Thanks.
Have you read Olaf Stapleton's science fiction?
Yes, I love Olaf Stapleton's science fiction.
Because it's exactly the topic that you're discussing.
Yeah, and I mean, Olaf Stapleton, Arthur C. Clarke was strongly influenced by Olaf Stapleton, as was Stanislaw Lem, and those are, you know, those are kind of the people that formed my worldview more than anybody.
Okay. If we're right about one thing, a brutal algorithm that survivors reproduce, then it's almost inevitable that we're going to have a pretty clear concept of what is real versus what is false or cultural or whatnot, because you would evolve in such an environment. And so I would have to think that your extraterrestrials can't be thoroughly distinguishable from us. I mean, in many ways, they would have to be rather similar, you would think.
Yeah, no, I agree. They've faced a lot of the same sort of winnowing pressures we have, and so it's quite likely that in some ways they are similar to us. But but there's a lot of fuzziness in those distinctions, and it would just be so interesting. You know, it would immediately illuminate many things. One of the things that would immediately illuminate to meet them would be which aspects of ourselves, that we suspect are not just accidental, are really that way.
Actually, that was going to be my first question. If we, why the optimism? If, for example, in astrobiology, we work on the assumption of life as we know it, and so I would, I wouldn't have the same optimism. I would suggest that they're going to screw it. And so I was going to ask you if
but that's that distribution.
Game, right.
Most of them do screw it up.
Yeah.
Most of them do screw it up. But the ones, most of the ones that start having technical civilizations kill themselves. But most of the ones that are out there are the ones that haven't killed themselves. Those two statements are completely consistent. They're mathematically consistent. I've worked out the numbers, and it's easy to see why. It's like seahorses. The reproductive strategy of seahorses is that they make thousands and thousands of, they're actually called ponies, of the little babies. And most of them die. And just a few of them make it to adulthood. So any given one is not going to survive, which may be true of civilizations. But yet the sea is, there are lots of seahorses.
Okay, the other one's a little bit, you have to stick with me for a minute. I was trying to get this in my talk too. So you're not just in the 40%, you're in a specific part of that 40%, the 13%. Who don't describe themselves as theists, and I used Ursula Goodenough as an example, and this how spirituality leads to this interconnectedness and an openness, and I like the way you put it, science is the doctrine there, okay? But at least right now, for most people, and so what you end up with is a real engagement with science, and your spirituality grows out of that. Where most people are is it's causing a disengagement science because the focus of it is on empowering my own life and making things better for me, and there's actually a disconnect, and that's where I'm not sure the disappearance of doctrine is such a good thing for science. If it serves something, and if you pick the Catholic Church, things change over time. The change isn't as quick as we like. A lot of us don't recognize it at all, but it happens because of this conversation that goes on between science and religion, and having to have a doctrine, having to come up with a doctrine, can feed that conversation. So this is my point. Spirituality is in terms, if your goal is an engagement with science, which personally I think is a good thing, spirituality can work for you. It can work against you. It's a tricky area.
Okay, before I answer, emergency announcement.
Park a white Yukon in the fire zone because it's going to get towed. Big white Yukon with no license plates, right? Brand new vehicles parked in the fire zone, fire lane. Okay, I didn't think it was one of us, but so.
We don't have new cars.
No problem. Okay, interesting question. What I would say, there's a lot of ways to respond to that, but we have this new story of the universe. We didn't know 1,000 years ago, we didn't know a few hundred years ago, that we know now, that is very compelling. And when I say know, it's a different kind of knowing because it's always changing, and that's part of what's built into it. So it's a really different kind of doctrine. It's a doctrine that you admit.
I have to stop.
No, let me answer you.
Doctrines change.
I know, but not specifically in this way. Yeah. See, now you made me forget your.
It's more of a comment. Spirituality.
See, every time you interrupt me, I'm going to forget even your last question.
It can be a pro, or it can be a con. That's it. It's not. It's more of a comment. Really.
I know. I don't dispute any of that. But what I'm saying is that I think in order to survive, we can't discard our spirituality. Some rationalist scientists, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins type, think, well, science will just replace. I don't think that's accurate. It doesn't do for us what religion has traditionally done. But I think we are going to ultimately need to integrate the two. And part of the way to do that is to have a spiritual perspective on our science and not just see them as separate. And we happen to have this great story that to me is more compelling than the stories in those books. And so that is my doctrine. And yes, and it's changeable. And yes, the other doctrines are and that's good, and that will help us achieve this integration, because it's not ultimately an either or, but the way in which the science doctrine is changeable is new and different, and I think kind of exciting, and will ultimately pave the way for this integration, which will be the thing that helps save us if we are to be saved, but I'm not sure there's hope for us. I'm just sure there's hope. John. Uh-oh.
Yes. Have you read A Fire Upon the Deep by Werner Vinge?
Yes.
Yes. The high transcend, the unthinking depths. A lot of parallels there. Anyhow, I wanted to read you. This is a regurgitated and partially remembered quotation, which I think is very germane. You might want to use it in the future. The dualism initiated by Luther, Machiavelli, and Descartes has brought us to the end of our tether, and either we must repair the gulf between faith and intellect, between self and others, between science and religion, between the individual and society, or we shall surely die from spiritual despair and physical annihilation. W.H. Auden.
Nice. Thank you.
And finally, how can you do this without once quoting Bob Marley?
Who feels it knows it. Penny.
Thanks. I'm sorry. Have you read a book called The Sparrow, published about 10 years ago by
Yes.
Maria Doria Russell?
Yes.
Well, I'm actually fairly firmly in the 10.8%. I don't think of myself as spiritual because I don't think I understand what that means. So I guess I come down in that relatively small minority. But I found that this book, which describes a Jesuit mission to the first extraterrestrial contact, very illuminating and eternally disturbing. I've read it 3 times now, and each reading I feel like I ought to be less disturbed because I should have been inoculated against this. And it disturbs me greatly every time. And it's this intense tragedy of going forth with good hope and good intentions, and believing that you have tapped into some universal spiritual truths, so that you will see other spirituality in the universe, and they go off in search of this, and it has a hideous, tragic end, which you can see like a train wreck coming.
Yeah.
And I've never been able to resolve this in my mind, and this fills me with sort of unease and fear in terms of,
Yeah.
you know, any assumptions we might make about our spirituality.
I hated that book. I mean, I found it riveting, but
Yeah,
it really
riveting.
bothered me too. I mean, the main thing that really bothered me about it was that the aliens weren't alien enough. And I mean, they really seemed like just variations of human beings. But the problem with the people that went on that expedition, in my view, was that they were Jesuits. They were religious. They weren't spiritual. They had very specific ideas about what ideas they wanted to confirm. They weren't just looking for answers. They were looking for very specific confirmation of very specific ideas.
Right. Yeah.
Vindication.
So they were blinded by their dogma rather than their spirituality, is what
Right.
you're saying. So if you have
Yeah.
a more open spirituality, you're suggesting possibly we would not fall into such a trap.
That's what struck me when I read that book.
Yeah. See, I think we're dumber than maybe you think we are.
But that's okay.
Sure.
If that's okay if for the universe, it's okay if we're that dumb. Then we just won't survive, and somebody else will.
Well, right, which is a bummer for us, as you
Yeah,
said.
yeah. I mean, and I'm kind of foolishly optimistic, at least in this cosmic way. I think it's worth a try.
Sure. Yeah, I'm more interested in the process than our fate, but.
Yeah.
Wanda Davis, NASA Ames. I wanted to bring up something else I learned about the Drake equation while recently I was writing and I had to use it. And I actually talked with Frank about this because I was thinking about another element of the equation, and that was the communication part. Because it's basically you're just picking up a signal from the civilization. And I had this conversation with Frank. I said, well, Frank, we have this, you know, Pioneer Venus, you know, on out there. It's, you know, somebody maybe someday will pick up a signal from it. We could be completely annihilated.
Pioneer 10 or 11.
Yeah, we could be completely annihilated. And he said it doesn't matter. The point is the signal is intercepted. And so, you know, we have this idea that we have to be in form and function to, you know, to bring something, to quote someone else's spirituality. But I think give this a thought, they're certainly going to get some information about us, whether we're annihilated or not, if this object is transcending the skies.
It's a nice idea, and I mean, one of the ideas in SETI is the notion of a message through time. If you create a physical message, then the sender doesn't even have to exist for the message to get there and send an effect. And I think that's true. I mean, imagine the reverse. Some object comes into our domain of being that clearly is created by has information that will change us and affect us and maybe affect our spirituality, whether or not those people exist anymore. So in some sense, then they live on, and we can do the same thing. And I think it's cool that we've sent out some physical artifacts that create some remnant of ourselves, and let's do more of it.
This isn't hypothetical. That's how we are influenced by the ancient Greeks.
Good point. Good point. So we receive information from societies that no longer exist, and we incorporate. They change us. They're part of. Mark.
Yeah, I just want to make a point. I think you touched on a mystery that's been around since the 60s, which is that about when we were talking about the cover of the Francis Crick book and directed panspermia. This could explain why all the aliens on Star Trek are bipedal and about 2 meters. I think you really hit on something there.
Good point. We're actually related to them if you go back far. Actually, wasn't there a Star Trek episode where they explained that? Some mythology that came out where it turned out we're related to them all a long time ago, and so that's why it...
Yeah, but this is a science workshop, so that was science fiction.
Hey,
now
you brought it up, dude.
Any other questions?
On that note. Thanks.
Mike, what we do now is we're right on time. Thank you, David.